See, all right. So today we have Matthew Hartke joining us, as well as the amateur Exegete. So, Matthew, let's start with you. To start off, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your content?
Oh, wow. A little bit about me. I was raised in a very devout, charismatic, evangelical environment. Was basically grew up in church all the time, every day of the week. But United Pentecostal, so very much into the gifts of the Spirit. We would march around the church, declaring in the name of God that the walls of Jericho will fall down, and that kind of thing. Watching, legs grow back, so that they're even again. All that kind of gimmicky Pentecostal stuff. But when I was about 15, my family moved to a ministry called the International House of Prayer. And that's a non-denominational charismatic ministry that is kind of, in some ways, it's mainstream charismatic evangelical, but in other ways, it's a lot of people would call it a cult. That language can obviously be very pejorative, but their main kind of distinctive is that they are 24/7 worship and prayer. They have live music, live worship bands, basically, what you do on Sunday morning, around the clock, 24/7, every day of the week. They've been doing that for over 20 years now, since 1999. But moved there when I was 15 and just went headlong into this environment that was just reading, praying, fasting every day, hours a day, and kind of fell in love with the Bible in that environment, but where, there's just a very enthusiastic, spiritual, highly charged spiritual environment where, dreams and visions, and they had a very heavy emphasis on the end times. So I believed that I was living in the last generation. Jesus was going to come back any minute, and we had a very detailed timeline, and of course, only we were exactly right about how that timeline was going to shake down. Exactly how to read Daniel and Revelation and the Olivet Discourse, and but I mean, it was very heady stuff. But I eventually became disillusioned with that, and just through reading the Bible and realizing that a lot of the things that we had been preaching and teaching, we had been saying since the 80s in that particular community, and it wasn't happening. And so I saw, just in kind of the evidence of some of the like documentary evidence of the community, how some of the recordings that they had from the 80s, that things were they were said a little bit differently. Some of the dreams and visions that they had and the way that they interpreted them, they had kind of had to have some dissonance reduction strategies to rationalize why it didn't quite happen the way that they thought it would then. And that experience was very eye-opening for me. But it was hard not to take that experience and that disillusionment, and for that to then become a filter and think, wait a second, is that what's actually going on in the Bible also? Is that what's going on in the Olivet Discourse? I mean, it seems like Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet who was saying, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. And could that be what was going on in the early church? Were they rationalizing the failure of their hopes? And that kind of became a question that I couldn't allow myself for about a decade. I was just trying, vehemently to find a way to interpret the Bible that didn't end in that conclusion. And where my early Christian experience would have had a heavy emphasis on my own personal spiritual experience, my later Christian experience became really heavy in just, academic study of the Bible. I was really into N.T. Wright for a long time, and he kind of had an interpretation of Jesus' eschatology and New Testament eschatology in general that helped me reduce dissonance in a way that I thought could be faithful to the New Testament, while at the same time avoiding that conclusion that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. But eventually I came to realize I actually can't I don't actually think that that's an honest way of looking at the evidence, and kind of had to bite the bullet on that. And eventually that kind of soaked through into the whole way that I now see the New Testament, where I don't think that there's anything really miraculous going on there. Anything in the early Christian movement that isn't just typical of the way that those things go in general, and the way that religions begin, and apocalyptic movements form, and then rationalize their failed expectations afterwards. And so I'm still really interested in Christian origins, and that's kind of, now, even while I don't believe anymore, it's just absolutely fascinating to me, and I don't think I'll ever stop studying it. But yeah, obviously I come at it from a very different perspective now than I used to.
You're just trying to rationalize your disbelief.
Yeah, no, exactly.
What do you got, Amateur Exegete? I feel like you're chomping at the bits. You saw you writing some stuff down. So
I was interested in IHOP. It's made me hungry, and that's what I wrote down. Yeah. So the apocalyptic prophet is a lot of what you're saying. It sounds like Dale Allison's book on.
I'm a huge fan of Dale Allison.
Yeah, I've seen you post, pictures of books he's written on the subject, but. Do you think the entire New Testament, or at least, like for example, Pauline literature, continues in this apocalyptic vein? Do you think Paul would consider himself, in some sense, an apocalyptic apostle, if you will? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that. I think that you have to make a distinction between, an apocalypticist in terms of like someone who writes apocalypses. So like, 4th Ezra, 2nd Baruch, obviously the Book of Revelation, Book of Daniel, those are apocalyptic literature. And so Paul isn't writing apocalyptic literature, but Paul does presuppose an apocalyptic worldview, the worldview of those kinds of apocalyptic writers. Both, I mean, the classic things like an expectation of the resurrection of the dead, but in the like cosmic battle between good and evil, an expectation that this is the last generation, that things are going to, the God's big final wrap up of history is just around the corner, that we're playing a part in that, and that we are the elect, and the kind of the way that I think the biggest distinction between apocalypses in my mind, or an apocalyptic worldview as kind of a late, Second Temple Jewish phenomenon, and earlier like prophetic worldview, is that apocalypses are just like the prophets, but just turned up to 11, where the prophets would be a lot more vague in their expectations and not be very finely tuned. Apocalyptic writers had a lot more of a concrete expectation with the resurrection of the dead, and a whole cosmic kind of upheaval, all of the kind of turning everything upside down, and it's going to happen in our generation. And so I definitely see Paul in that tradition. Both, I mean, you can see it in, specific places like 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, where he says, we who are alive and remain, we will be caught up together with those who have fallen asleep, those who have died before us in the clouds when Jesus returns. And that seems like an expectation that is pretty clearly putting himself in this group with his contemporaries and saying, there's going to be some of us who are going to be alive when Jesus returns. But then also, I think 1 Corinthians 7 is a really big one, where Paul says that there's this time of distress that we're currently in. And I forget exactly what his language is, but he's talking about how people who are unmarried should remain unmarried. People who are married should remain married. People who are slaves shouldn't seek to become free, or vice versa, because it's the end of the age, and there's really no point in trying to change your circumstances, since everything's going to end here pretty soon anyway.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. See, because I'm thinking about, when you mentioned the prophets, and I'm reading in the prophet Micah, and his concerns are just so immediate and just so present for him, social concerns mostly. But you compare him with, Deutero Isaiah or Trito Isaiah, and these are completely different completely different subjects they're talking about. You kind of see that evolution of concern, and I think I think like you talked about, Paul is definitely in that vein of of course he thinks of himself as a called prophet. He uses the language of Jeremiah to describe himself. So yeah, I think you definitely hit the nail on the head there. It's interesting.
I think a big, probably another distinction between like an earlier prophetic worldview and then more of an apocalyptic later Second Temple Jewish worldview would be the determinism of an apocalyptic worldview versus the what's often called like a Deuteronomist perspective, but the kind of Deuteronomy 28-30. I set before you today blessing and curse, and choose walk with me and you will get blessings, and walk, if you do not follow my commandments, then you'll receive curses. But that obviously you see throughout the Old Testament, there's a lot of disillusionment with the fact that, well, it doesn't actually seem like it works like that. The wicked often prosper and the righteous often don't prosper.
And the book of Job is all about, look at the world. It does not work the way you think it does.
And it seems like the apocalyptic worldview really emerges as, through Israel's exile and trying to figure out why that's not happening. I think of like Habakkuk is, we're in exile, the Babylonians have conquered, and like, how long, God, until your promises are going to be fulfilled? And the old kind of, follow me and you will prosper answer doesn't really seem to work out. And so the apocalyptic writers are trying to make sense of that, and their way of kind of doubling down on their belief is to get, instead of getting more vague, is to get more detailed in their expectations, and to say, okay, no, I prayed. Daniel 9 is a classic example, but Daniel's praying, wondering why the prophecies of Jeremiah 25 to 31, those 70 years of exile, why they haven't come to pass. And then the angel Gabriel comes and gives him revelation. And that is a classic dissonance reducing rationalization, where it wasn't 70 years, it was 70 times 70 years. It was kind of this mega jubilee, and that helps give him clarity. But the point is that it's in the doubling down and in the rationalization, it becomes more clear, like more definite, like you get really detailed about how history is going to wrap up, but with just enough room to make an escape route for later generations to then rationalize if that doesn't happen. And I think that in a lot of ways, the whole tradition of apocalyptic literature and the secondary exegesis around that, the reception history of apocalyptic literature within communities of faith, is a tradition of dissonance reduction, and how do we take these prophecies and reinterpret them in such a way that we can still believe in them today. And for me, growing up in that kind of dispensationalist environment, where we took the Olivet Discourse, the Book of Revelation, and everything was about the establishment, the reestablishment of Israel in 1948 and 1967 when they took Jerusalem, and that means this is the last generation, and and that gets harder and harder to believe. Obviously now it's 2020, and how are those dates so significant? is this really one generation since 1948? Not really, but we find different ways of rationalizing that and
Exactly.
working it out. So, but that was exactly what I was dealing with. That how do I actually make this fly? And yeah.
Before we go too much into like the New Testament stuff, I kind of want to come back to the IHOP thing, other than the fact that it makes us hungry. So, well, it's interesting. I don't know if I even knew about that movement, other than I think I read a blog post that you wrote about how being, your experience within that movement helped you kind of look at the New Testament a different way. It is interesting though, like how, like you said, that worship that's the crazy constant worship all the time,
every day. Yeah.
And I've noticed, whether you want to call it a cult or not, like some of these movements that have like this kind of like every day is like the significant, the constantly immersed. Like I remember meeting some people. I don't know if you guys are familiar. I don't know what it's called. The Mother God people. I don't know if you know. I can't remember the movement's name, but anyway, like it's like the same thing. There's like worship services like during the week, and all these people are like super committed. Like, is this? Yeah. I don't know if there's something to that where like, the meaning and purpose stuff that's like constantly, it's like your whole life is this,
Yeah.
more so than like, I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, a regular Christian wouldn't be like that, but there's something different about having worship services every day.
I mean, it's going to normal like church just on Sunday and maybe on Wednesday, like after being in that kind of high octane, like, I mean, it really is kind of a drug, experiencing that kind of charismatic worship that's, you know, high in experiential, like, you know, we're singing, you know, a normal day for me would be that I would wake up at 5 a.m. I would be in the prayer room by 6 a.m. and then I would be in there from 6 a.m. until noon every day, just praying and studying the Bible and singing. And I would be on the worship teams, I would be on the prayer teams, and I mean, it was intense. But you have like, you know, fostering that kind of technology of prayer for that many hours a day, and fostering an expectation, that kind of confirmation bias that goes into that environment where you are expecting to hear from God on a regular basis, and you do hear from God on a regular basis. But going from that environment to then like a normal Christian life, I went through a period of like this deep, dark night of the soul, and I realized this is a pretty common story for people who came out of that community. When you're not like in the temple, you know, of constant worship and prayer all the time, it's really hard to sustain that kind of spiritual experience that you become used to experiencing without that community all around you doing that on a regular basis. And that probably my first big like season of doubt that I went through was the you know, the problem of divine hiddenness, but just in that very personal sense of like, I say I believe in this God who is like the great initiator of relationship. He is the one who has, you know, bent over backwards to meet with me, and who is, you know, I'm the one who's supposed to be responding to him. But why does it seem like he only ever feels near, and it only ever feels like he's real and speaking to me when I'm investing a ton in this relationship in very intentional ways, and developing this kind of, you know, these habits and technology of prayer, that if I stop doing that, it feels like he doesn't exist. And you know, that's kind of suspicious.
Like you might be, you know, tricking yourself a little bit through all that stuff, or brainwashing yourself. How did you? I mean, so obviously you were a kid when you got into that movement. How did your parents discover that movement in the first place? Like, how did you go from? How did they get into that movement?
Well, I mean, they were kind of in that charismatic world.
Okay,
you know, my whole life. But you know, with the Toronto Blessing and the Florida kind of, you know, all the different revivals that took place throughout the 90s, they were on those. Yeah, Brownsville. That's what I was thinking of. They were into those, but in the 80s, what the International House of Prayer came out of was a movement in the 80s called the Kansas City Prophets. And it was kind of, you know, with kind of connected with Brownsville and with Toronto and all of those, but their emphasis was on prophecy and on raising up a group of end time forerunners like John the Baptist, who are going to prepare the way of the Lord, prepare for the second coming, just like John the Baptist prepared for the first coming. And my parents were really into that. And after 9/11, my dad we were living in Seattle, and my dad got laid off from his job at Boeing. Boeing, after 9/11, kind of took the opportunity to lay off a lot of their mechanics. And so my dad got laid off after working with Boeing for 20 years. And we were in a place of, you know, not being able to sustain our life in the Northwest, and, you know, going through that like economic hardship. And it seemed like, oh, this is the perfect opportunity. God is calling us to go into full-time ministry and move to Kansas City and become a part of the International House of Prayer. And, you know, in retrospect, it's interesting because like apocalyptic worldviews often thrive in situations of economic distress, political distress, existential distress. And for me, like finding that worldview in a community that was fostering that kind of worldview as a 15-year-old who had kind of been plucked out of, you know, everything that was like my like stability in life. It gave me a sense of control, a sense of, you know, something I could like stand on, a firm ground that I could stand on, to know like, oh, this is what's happening in history, and all of this, you know, geopolitical turmoil, and then in our life personally, you know, the lack of control and the lack of sense that I see in the world is made up for by the fact that, you know, here in the book of Revelation, it says that this is what it's going to be like.
Right.
And it was, I was ripe for the picking for that kind of worldview. Yeah.
And one more thing too to touch on before we go. Obviously, I want to spend most of the time talking about historical Jesus stuff. Did you deconvert like immediately, or like what was your process? So you got disillusioned with IHOP. What was your path out of Christianity like after that point?
It was about a decade-long process, I would say. But the first thing to go was inerrancy, as is so often the case. Seeing the contradictions between different, you know, stories in the Gospels, like the death of Judas was a big one, where I was like looking at that and being like, oh my gosh, like looking at the account of Judas's death in Matthew versus the account in Acts, and there's some pretty drastic differences. And read Peter Enns and his book Inspiration and Incarnation, and that really helped me. That inspirational model of, the incarnational model of inspiration that he has in that book really helped me kind of hold on to the inspiration of the Bible while acknowledging all of the human error in it. But Peter Enns is an Old Testament scholar, and that really helped in, you know, looking at all of the Old Testament issues of, you know, myth in the early parts of the Bible, whether in the creation account or Exodus. And I don't know, there's a passage in C.S. Lewis, I'm trying to remember where it is, but where he talks about the gospel as being kind of the myth become fact.
Like the true myth or something like that.
The true myth. And he talks about how in the early parts of the Old Testament, it's like the myth to fact ratio. It's like really high myth when you're looking at like the creation accounts in Genesis and the Tower of Babel and, you know, the flood, and then you get through the Exodus, and then as you move forward in time to the accounts of like the life of David, and then through the exile, and then come up to the life of Jesus, that myth to history ratio, it gets the myth kind of goes down as you move towards Jesus, and the historicity of it increases until you get to Jesus, and the myth becomes fact. It's all of the legend is kind of, you know, eclipsed by the like solid rock of history that is the life of Jesus. And that model of reading the Bible really helped me for about a decade, where I was like, okay, I can acknowledge all of this other stuff, that all of the problems, that genocide and the myth throughout the Bible, I can acknowledge that, and yet like hang my hat on Jesus. That's the thing that really matters. And so kind of took a, you know, progressive revelation, a kind of trajectory hermeneutic of, you know, making Jesus the end all and be all. And as long as I can believe, ultimately, like the resurrection was the thing. As long as I can believe in the resurrection, I can still call myself a Christian. And so, had a lot of investment then in, you know, seeing is the resurrection true? And if I can believe in the resurrection, then I can still hang on to this. And I became obsessed with the resurrection, I think, because I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just confirmation bias, that I wasn't just, you know, stuck in the kind of epistemic ghetto of personal experience and trying to justify my personal experience and the way that I was raised, et cetera, et cetera. And so I read N.T. Wright's big book on the resurrection, read Mike Licona, Gary Habermas, got really into that. And for a long time was really convinced by those kind of classic apologetic arguments for the historicity of the resurrection, the minimal facts and all of that. But the longer I sat on it, the more questions I got, and the more those turned into these big nagging doubts that I wasn't seeing any of them really address. And that then ultimately, like, I realized, I have this really huge metaphysical house on this really small, really weak foundation, and it just can't hold the weight of this worldview. And so then I had to say, okay, I guess I'm agnostic. But yeah, that was about a 10-year journey, probably, from like letting go of inerrancy to finally realizing, you know what, the resurrection, I don't really see a ton of evidence for. And I have a lot of friends who at that point would have still said, and still do say, like, I would still call myself a Christian. But once I gave up the resurrection, I was like, out of respect for this tradition, it seems like if there's anything that is kind of a non-negotiable part of Christianity, the resurrection would be it. And so if I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, then I don't think I can call myself a Christian anymore. And I still think there are a lot of beautiful things in the Christian tradition. But yeah, I don't think I could say I believe any of the like creedal metaphysical claims of Christianity.
It was a spiritual resurrection, Matthew.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and that's, talking about Dale Allison. Dale Allison is someone who, I respect a ton because he's not an apologist at all. But he still does believe in the resurrection, but he doesn't know what that looks like. And he thinks maybe it was a spiritual resurrection. Like maybe the disciples didn't see Jesus physically. Maybe they had visions. Maybe they were like bereavement visions. But we can't really say with the tools of history whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. It's kind of something that you have to take by faith, and has to be a part of like the complete package of a worldview that is arrived at on other grounds or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think I respect that more than trying to, if you try and hang your hat on the historicity of the resurrection, I don't think you can do that in the way that I tried to.
Well, have you not read this apologist I'm about to mention? I'm just kidding. What do you got? I was going to say, I feel like I've asked the last couple of questions. So if you have anything.
Well, no, on that subject, specifically the historicity of the resurrection, you've got apologists like Gary Habermas, who has these minimal facts. So what would you make what do you make of the argument for minimal facts? What do you think it actually suggests? And what do you make of apologists who try to use that to jump to this very sure conclusion that Jesus is currently alive?
In general, I don't have a problem with the facts themselves. I do have a problem with the language of facts in general. Even like calling them facts is, I think, claiming more than we can. When if you're actually thinking historically, then you want to talk about levels of probability. But given the amount of data that we have, it's a very small window that we're looking through, and it's a stained glass window where all of the data is filtered through the beliefs of the people who are relaying that information to us in the first place. And so it's very hard to get at kind of some like rock hard, fact, 2000 years removed with very little information to go on. So I would have a problem calling them facts, but in general, I think I could accept, the minimal facts are like Jesus died by crucifixion. Like, absolutely. If we can say anything about Jesus historically, he died by crucifixion. That's a pretty safe bet. And so that does deal with like the swoon theory. But nobody really forwards the swoon theory. That doesn't really get us very far. The one that I think is the most important one is just that the disciples they believed that they saw Jesus risen from the dead. And that's, that there was individual experiences and group experiences of Jesus appearing to them alive after the crucifixion. And that's something that most scholars would accept, that at least some of the disciples did believe that they saw Jesus alive after the crucifixion. Now, what you can actually do with that historically, I don't think is nearly as much as the minimal facts argument thinks that you can. And in that sense, I think the minimal facts argument really kind of functions like a Trojan horse, where you get in the door with these kind of bare bones facts, but then in order to actually kind of cut off at the pass any suggestions of any other alternative, like kind of naturalistic explanations of those facts, you have to rely on a lot more than just those facts. Like, and a classic example would be if someone puts forward the hallucination hypothesis as an explanation for the appearances of Jesus to the disciples, the way that Gary Habermas or Michael Licona or any of those people would respond would say, no, that can't be the case, because group hallucinations don't happen. Hallucinations are individual occurrences that happen in individual minds, and so therefore, like that they can't be group hallucinations. The problem with that, I mean, there are a lot of problems with that. It's highly debatable whether that really is true, because there are a lot of accounts in literature on like UFO sightings and then visions of the Virgin Mary and things like that, where people believe that they see, whole groups of people believe that they see the same thing that physically isn't there all the time. It happens a lot. But obviously the question is when we sit these people down, can we interview them individually and arrive at if we say, okay, what did the aliens look like? And you get them fresh before any of them have actually kind of coalesced on a story together, because the problem with memory is that it's often formed, like collective memories are formed communally, and the most dominant personalities or the majority, what they say kind of has a huge influence on what individuals then come to believe really happened. I think a recent example of this, I don't know if you guys remember, I think it was around the time of the 2016 elections, where Trump said that he was saying repeatedly, he claimed that there was people during 9/11 on TV, huge crowds in New Jersey who were, crowds of Muslims who were cheering and celebrating, dancing in the street over the destruction of the towers. And then because he said that, then literally thousands of Americans agreed with that and have this memory where they think like this really happened. There's no evidence of anything like that happening, but you have a very strong personality in Trump who is making this claim about this memory, and just the fact of saying that makes people feel like, people who that claim, sits well with their worldview, agrees with their particular blend of confirmation bias, and that's a real memory that a lot of people have, even though it didn't happen. As far as we know. So, it's something like that where memory formation is a really tricky thing. Just yesterday, I think I wrote this on Twitter, but my parents just visited and they have a story that's very formative to their faith. But it's an experience they had where they were traveling through a storm, and their Suburban that they were in was rocking back and forth in this storm, and my mom looks in the rearview mirrors and there are men in running shorts on both sides of the car. Looked in one rearview mirror, looked in the other one, and there are these men in short shorts, it's the 80s, and they're holding the car, and then the car stopped rocking back and forth, and they got through the storm and they were safe, and they were like, oh my gosh, this is a miracle. But I always heard that story. I heard them tell this story so many times, and I thought that they both saw these men in running shorts, but they just visited and they told that story again. And turns out, at least to how they tell the story now, just my mom saw the men. My dad didn't see them. But so that's an instance where even though I heard that story dozens of times throughout my life, for some reason I thought that it was a group encounter when it was just an individual encounter. But all of that to say, to try and make a claim that, to move from the claim some disciples believed that they all saw Jesus risen, appeared to them, to move from that to say that can't be a hallucination because group encounters don't happen, is presupposing a hermeneutic of trust where we can basically believe word for word what the gospel accounts say about those group experiences, and that those are basically word for word history. And so it's an instance where the claim of the minimal facts is that, we're only making our argument based on what the vast majority of critical scholars, both Christian and non-Christian, say about the evidence. But when it gets down to it, they default to their evangelical presuppositions about that evidence. And they can't actually rule out naturalistic explanations of those minimal facts without presupposing that evangelical hermeneutic of trust.
Yeah, the example from Trump's comments about the Twin Towers reminds me of the Mandela effect.
Yeah,
where people think they remember seeing this funeral for Nelson Mandela. There's other examples of that throughout history. And but yeah, when I was younger, I have this very vivid memory of going to Disney World in Florida, or Disneyland, and going on the It's a Small World After All ride.
Okay.
And this witch popping out from the wall. I was 1 or 2 years old, but it's very vivid in my mind, very vivid. So I talked to my mother probably 6-8 months ago. I said, do you remember going on this ride and this witch popping out from the wall? There was no witch, nothing. It's a completely false memory. She doesn't know where it comes from, but it's something I invented, and I've had it it's my earliest memory. That is no memory at all. It's just bizarre the way we form memories. And I think that isn't what happened with the resurrection appearances, but I think there's an element of that. I think you mentioned bereavement hallucinations, where people they see what they want to see, and they because I think Peter saw something. I don't know if the other disciples did.
Yeah.
But Peter did, and I'm sure Peter exerted incredible influence over everybody, and they sincerely believed that Jesus was alive. And
and you have in Matthew, and then in basically in some form or another in all of the gospel accounts, you have this kind of minority report where some doubted. And what would it be like if we actually had testimonies, eyewitness testimonies from those people who doubted? Because obviously the narrative that we have isn't told from the perspective of those people who doubted.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we don't know. And I mean, I know like Mike Licona argues that statement that some doubted doesn't mean that they kept on doubting, and it must maybe, but I mean, that's a particular interpretation of that evidence that that could be true, but I find it doubtful. I doubt it.
Yeah, I think we assume that ancient people just believed everything that was told. Like they are somehow they were less discerning than we are. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that people just, if somebody had said if somebody in the first century was told, hey, somebody rose from the dead, I think they'd be skeptical of it. I don't think they would automatically think, oh yeah, sure. No, I don't think that was the case. I think they were just as skeptical as we are. I just think we have better tools now to determine whether these things are true or not. But the idea that they just believed it because they were primitive or whatever, come on, no one believes that.
No, I agree, and that's a point that that N.T. Wright makes that I think is really valuable. But the Epicureans are a really good example of people. I mean, you can read Epicurean works from the first century, or not from the first century, from I think it would probably be second or third at least, but where they are mocking Christians because of their belief in the resurrection. They sound a lot like modern people.
Yeah.
So now that we're kind of talking about the historical evidence, let's say a random Christian popped into the stream. What would if you were to lay out a case against the resurrection briefly, like what would you say to that person? Like why you don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead?
I mean, first of all, I would say that the evidence is like I said earlier, the window that we have, the window of access into that is really small, and it's kind of like that picture of the Loch Ness monster, where it's like if you're predisposed to believe that the Loch Ness monster is real, then that like grainy black and white photo of the Loch Ness monster that we don't really know, like, you know, the process of how that who took this picture, where did it come from, like, you know, if you're predisposed to believe in it, you will. If you aren't, you won't. And there's, I think, something analogous in the resurrection accounts, where it's like these are narratives that are produced by a community that believes in it, but we have those same kind of narratives for things like UFO sightings, visions of the Virgin Mary, that actually I'm reading a book right now, actually, this book, Visionaries, by William A. Christian Jr., and it's a history of visions of the Virgin Mary that took place in the Basque country of Spain in 1931. And
Recent history.
Yeah, it's pretty recent history, and most of the accounts he got, firsthand from these people when they were elderly. So the level of like historical access that he has to these people is a lot better than we have to the New Testament. And obviously some people would, they would put a big stake in saying that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony, and you have the Richard Bauckham kind of argument, but that's highly debatable stuff. And very few critical scholars follow in that route. And even Richard Bauckham doesn't think that the Gospels were actually written by eyewitnesses, and so there's a key distinction there.
People like to claim Richard Bauckham, and they've never actually read Richard Bauckham.
But the key thing about this in particular, and there's all sorts of this is an account of one kind of spurt of visions of the Virgin Mary that took place in this particular community at this particular time and place. And over the last 200 years, there have been tons of these kinds of situations where religious enthusiasm takes a community, and for a period of months or years, hundreds of people have these visions of the Virgin Mary that confirm their particular religious ideology, and in this case, Catholicism. But this one, what's interesting about this one is that it's not accepted by the Vatican, and so not even mainstream Catholics would consider these veridical. But there are group encounters here. Where groups of over a dozen people claimed to see and would not recant their testimony of seeing the Virgin Mary and her speaking with them. And that's a lot more solid historically than what we have with any of the testimony concerning the resurrection. But going beyond that, and the kind of narrow window of access that we have, you have contradictions, huge contradictions. And it's the contradictions in the resurrection narratives is much higher than you have throughout most of the rest of the gospel. And so it's not even an argument of like the general unreliability of the gospel. Like I tend to be someone who sees a pretty high, I would take a lot of the synoptic gospels as containing history. And there's a lot of agreement between them, and things that I think we can get at the historical Jesus in a lot of ways from what we have in the data in the synoptic gospels. But it all kinds of falls apart when you get to the resurrection narratives. The level of agreement to disagreement, the disagreement is so high. The only thing really comparable to the level of divergence in the narratives that you have in the resurrection accounts is the birth narratives. is the level of divergence that you have between Luke and Matthew in their birth narratives about Jesus. And so that is, I think, a big issue that isn't often appreciated by apologists. And the other one is legendary development. Legendary development. There are really clear signs of legendary development in the resurrection narratives, and we could talk about those if you want. And
well, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. So, first of all, let's take the resurrection in Mark, and let's just assume that Matthew and Luke used Mark, okay, for the sake of argument. Why would Mark have the very first witnesses to the resurrection be women, especially when we know from history that women's testimonies generally were considered unreliable? What possible purpose could Mark have in using female characters as the primary witnesses to the empty tomb?
That's a really good one, and I think this is a perfect example, because the women finding the tomb empty is one of those things that conservative scholars often regard as being one of those bedrock historical facts that there's just no conceivable way that the early church, that Mark or whoever Mark's source is, would make that kind of story up. Because you just wouldn't make women the people finding the tomb empty. But there actually really are really good reasons for thinking that it could have been made up. And what the way that Mark crafts that narrative, it kind of reads like in apocalyptic literature, where you have in Daniel, the angel says to Daniel, when Daniel writes his whole vision down, the angel says, seal this up until the time of the end, because many will go to and fro, and blah blah blah. You're going to die, and people are going to read this, but it's like the what's called ex eventu prophecies after the fact, where the time that the author is claiming to have written isn't actually the time that they did write it, that they actually wrote it during the events that they're supposedly prophesying. And that's a literary device that, seal it up until the time of the end, is a way that the author is able to explain the fact that nobody has ever seen this document before until these things are actually taking place. And it's this book has been hidden until right now. And it would make sense to read Mark as doing something similar to that in the discovery of the empty tomb, because it says at the end of his narrative, he says, and the women ran away and they told nobody because they were afraid. And that could be a way that Mark is explaining why no one has heard this story before, until 30 years later, 30 to 40 years later, he's writing this story, and all of a sudden there's this narrative of women discovering this tomb. I mean, you don't have anything like that before Mark.
Paul doesn't. Yeah.
Paul doesn't say it in 1 Corinthians 15. He, maybe something like an empty tomb is implied there. I think that Paul thought that Jesus was raised bodily, but the fact remains he doesn't say anything about an empty tomb. And so, that you could argue that the absence of evidence there is evidence of absence, and that it would be apologetically valuable for the early church to have had an empty tomb in their creed from the get-go if there really was a discovery of an empty tomb. And so why doesn't Paul include that there? Maybe not, but the fact is that we don't have any evidence of a discovery of an empty tomb until 40 years later, when Mark writes his gospel. And the fact that women are the ones who find the tomb empty could be a way of saying, oh, you know how women are. They are easily frightened. And so they were afraid and they didn't tell anyone. And obviously, Matthew then takes his source, Mark, and he changes it so the women go and immediately tell the disciples because they were filled with joy, and the disciples hear about it, and then they go to Galilee like Jesus told them, and then they see Jesus in Galilee.
The women see Jesus too. They're the first ones to see Jesus when they come back.
So I'm not settled on that, whether or not, the question of the empty tomb in general is something where I see good arguments for it and I see good arguments against it, but there's not an ironclad case in either direction. And so it's one of those things that the data is underdetermined right there. And I wouldn't hang my hat on it either way. And so to try and, rest a whole worldview on that just doesn't work.
Yeah. So far you basically said, I wouldn't say, so the testimonial evidence is kind of unimpressive compared to other stuff. Is kind of what you said so far.
Yeah, stuff that's happened recently. Yeah.
Right.
Nowhere near it.
Well, it's interesting too. I just don't feel compelled to accept. People debate how you define a miracle and all. Sometimes I think that detracts away from the conversation. You know what I mean? But I just don't feel compelled if I think that testimony by itself is all I have for these kinds of miraculous claims. I just don't feel compelled. Like, I feel like people should be compelled, or people should act like the evidence is so good you should be compelled to accept it. Because I've said this in other streams before, but like my Christianity was held up by multiple pillars, and so the resurrection seemed plausible to me within a structure of like, I thought that these prophecies were pointing to Jesus. I thought that the Gospels were more reliable than they are. I thought that this was all packaged in this divine book that had like no mistakes in it. So like there's these things that are holding the belief up. That once it's just the testimony itself, then I'm just like, I just don't think it's that good. Like, it's really not. Yeah. At least, my opinion.
Yeah. And I think that if apologists were, this sounds pejorative, but if they were more honest with themselves, they would have to admit that their belief in the resurrection is a part of a whole package, and that it is a hermeneutic of trust that they're taking towards all of it, the reliability of the Gospels, the existence of God, like that raises their prior probabilities a ton before they even get to the evidence for or against the resurrection. And so they're primed to see it favorably. But when those other things fall by the wayside, and if you just try and go to the evidence for the resurrection as the kind of the last pillar holding onto your faith, like I did, and it seems like you did, you can't rest everything on that. It doesn't hold up.
But Paul had a conversion experience.
Well, okay,
that's a great one. Let's talk about Paul, because
that's right. Exactly where I was going to go was Paul. Here's Paul.
Paul's the person who the apologist would want to point to first, because 1 Corinthians 15 is the earliest record of the resurrection that we have. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, he appeared first to Cephas, then to the 12, then to James, then the 500 and all the apostles, and then last of all he appeared to me as to one untimely born or born unusually. And that's one interesting thing about that, I think that isn't appreciated by apologists. And again, I think that this points towards their hermeneutic of trust. It's that Paul is actually the only firsthand eyewitness testimony for an appearance of the risen Jesus that we have. You can argue for there being firsthand eyewitness testimony, obviously, but it's going to be, if you actually take the ultra conservative line of eyewitness authorship of the Gospels, that you have then firsthand eyewitness testimony to any of the other appearances of the risen Jesus. If you take a majority view to the Gospels, then Paul is it. All we have is Paul, and then second or third or fourth hand testimony of everything else. And so that puts a lot of weight on Paul, and that puts a lot of weight on Paul's own conversion experience, because that's it really that we have in terms of like a solid eyewitness testimony for an appearance of the risen Jesus. And the problem with that is that from both the accounts of Paul's conversion experience in Acts and his own account of that in Galatians 1, it seems like by far most likely that what Paul experienced was a non-corporeal, non-physical, mind internal vision of Jesus, not an external physical corporeal experience. And that's for sure what Luke thinks it was in his account of Paul's conversion in Acts. In Acts 26, I think it's verse 19, he says, speaking as Paul, Paul says, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. He calls it a heavenly vision. But then in Galatians 1, where Paul is talking about his conversion experience, he calls it a revelation, and uses the same language. That's apocalypsis, but it's the same language that he talks about his third heaven experience in 2 Corinthians 12, and that's routinely used for visionary experiences. I mean, it is the language of the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of debate about when he talks about that it happened to him or in him.
Yeah, I think the Greek word is "en," isn't it? Isn't the preposition "en"?
There's debate. Yeah, I know. I have here behind me,
It's Galatians 1, right?
James Dunn's commentary on Galatians, and Dunn argues. He says, here he describes it as an act of revelation, as an unveiling of the heavenly reality, which is Christ as God's Son raised from the dead. This ties in with the records in Acts of Paul seeing the exalted Christ as a heavenly vision. That there was an auditory as well as a visual identification of the exalted Christ is not excluded by what Paul says here. At the same time, he says, in me, which presumably indicates Paul's awareness of the subjectivity of such a vision. However, quote unquote, objective, the reality thus seen. So as far as Dunn is concerned, and Dunn is a relatively conservative New Testament scholar, but he thinks that in me does suggest the subjectivity of the experience that had happened in Paul, and that it wasn't an external experience. So I lean towards agreeing with that. So, but that then, raises questions. And given the fact that Paul is the earliest that we have in 1 Corinthians 15, the creed that he recounts, and the fact that he attaches his own experience in that sequence right alongside all the rest of the appearances of Jesus, begs the question, whether those other experiences were of the same sort as his experience or a different sort. What kind of experience were they? And until we get to Matthew, but especially mostly Luke and John, the two latest gospels, there's not an emphasis on the physicality of the experiences themselves until you get to really Luke and John, and where Jesus appears to the disciples and then is eating fish with them and saying, here, touch my side, see that it's me and not a ghost. Don't be doubting, but believe. And this, very obvious apologetic emphasis on trying
reacting to some kind of
and maybe it's reacting against Docetism, or maybe it's just it's just the story growing, and the fact that they did believe, and it seems like Paul believed that his experience of Jesus was confirmation that Jesus was alive from the dead, that he was that this was a resurrection and not just his spirit being in heaven. But from that belief, kind of a historicizing, it seems like there's a development of a kind of historicizing of that belief that Jesus was alive, to then fleshing that out in narrative form into these stories of the disciples then touching his side, and it becoming more and more tangible, more and more physical, where originally it was just maybe visions. And that was enough for the first generation.
Yeah.
But so that's, Paul, to try and make Paul a place to pin to hang your hat and say that this is, kind of a strength. It's another one of
I
those.
think the appeal for Paul is, if you take Acts to be an accurate representation of Paul, that he was this very violent,
Right.
anti-Christian person,
Yeah.
and for him to make this complete 180 is just very surprising.
Yeah.
If it was not the case that Jesus
Which,
rose from the dead and
if
appeared
you
to him.
don't study cross-cultural religious movements at all, like, and this is the only example that you know of someone who's virulently opposed to something and then doing a 180-degree turn and becoming a convert to that view, that seems like, oh my gosh, that must be God. But if you look at other religious movements, and I mean, it's the conversions like that are actually really common. And I mean, classic examples are like, fascist, guard watching over communist prisoners, and because of his like connection, obviously it's a negative connection to the prisoners, but over time then becoming converted to become that, then it becomes an outspoken communist. And people who are closely connected to their adversaries, there's a fixation on the beliefs of their adversaries, and that fixation makes it so that it's not extremely common, but just the fact that they are so closely connected with that enemy, with that other view, it becomes more of a live option for them to change their view and jump on that other ship.
And it's not really as if Paul's views were that out of alignment with those of early followers. He didn't convert to Christianity. He just added Jesus as Messiah to his Judaism.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they were just diametrically opposed views.
And that's something I think where we do tend towards anachronism, and we think in like modern categories where these are totally different religions. There's Christianity, and then there's Judaism, and they are so far apart. But obviously, in the first century, Christianity wasn't a separate religion. It was a sect of Judaism, and it was an apocalyptic sect of Judaism that was very close to Paul's apocalyptic version of Judaism as a Pharisee. Exactly. And so while he saw it obviously prior to his conversion as a heretical iteration of Judaism, one that was worth opposing, from an outside perspective, it's like Methodists versus Presbyterians. How different are they really?
Yeah. So the other couple things too, you could, I guess, briefly touch on is, so we talked a little bit about legendary development, and then also how you view dissonance reduction as a way to possibly explain kind of the origin of Christianity. I know that's a big thing for you. So do you want to touch on both of those things too, real quick?
Yeah. Legendary development. That's a huge one in itself. But we mentioned a couple of points already, like where in Mark's account, which it seems like Matthew and Luke are both just working off of Mark and then adding their own stuff on top of that, either from other sources or from themselves. But one place where Matthew is working off of Mark, and the fact that he is working off of Mark makes it really clear when he diverges from Mark that this is what we're dealing with here is redactional. It is an author changing something, and another word for that is legendary development. But in the empty tomb narrative, the discovery of the empty tomb in Mark, the women, is that my microphone?
I think so. It might be.
Let me take out my headphones and see if that fixes it.
I don't hear anything.
Oh man, that makes it even worse. Right. I think it's stopped now.
Is it better now? No. Should I try and refresh this?
I don't think that'll do. I don't know if it's rubbing against your beard or something. I'm not sure if that has affected it. I don't know.
Hello, testing. No.
Yeah.
Does it still sound grainy to you guys?
I hear it a little bit. I'm not sure if
it's like completely garbled for me. Hello, hello.
Can you hear me? Hear me?
Well, yeah, I can barely hear you. Let me try and
Let me try to mute you real quick.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Hopefully it's not me. I don't see why it would be, though.
Did you mess it up?
Yeah, I don't know what the issue is.
Testing.
God has sabotaged this live stream.
Well, do we want to continue and just muscle through it, or do you want to try and maybe just restart the stream and see?
You're
Hello?
muted. Dust. There you go.
Yeah, I know I was muted. I was just trying to see if you'd still hear it if I muted. I don't, because I'm trying to figure out where the problem is.
I don't hear anything at all. There's no problem on my end whatsoever.
That's weird.
Yeah, and for me, it's when any of us talk, I hear the feedback.
Okay.
Now it's actually fine now.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello? Weird.
Yes. I prayed to Allah, and so now it's fixed.
Now we have confirmation. Okay.
All right, we can keep going. You were talking about legendary development.
Yeah, so Matthew, in his narrative of the discovery of the empty tomb, he takes, verbatim from Mark, where Mark has the women, the last verse of Mark's narrative before the added extra part of Mark that isn't original. He has the women flee from the tomb, he says, because they were afraid, they didn't tell the disciples, and that's where Mark ends. Matthew obviously isn't satisfied with that ending, and so he needs to do something to be able to continue his narrative into the appearance of Jesus on the mountain in Galilee. And so he has the women run with fear and with great joy, and they immediately go and tell the disciples what Jesus told them, and then the narrative continues. So that's a pretty clear instance of legendary development. Another one where Luke does something with Mark that's very similar. Mark obviously points towards an appearance in Galilee, even though he doesn't tell that story at all. He says, tell the disciples that I will meet them in Galilee. And then Matthew obviously has that narrative, then a narrative of Jesus appearing to the disciples in Galilee. Luke wants to have all of his appearances in and around Jerusalem. He wants to stay in Jerusalem. And so he needs to do something with Jesus telling the women to tell the disciples to meet them in Galilee. And so where Mark's text reads, tell the disciples I'll meet them in Galilee, Luke says, remember when I was with you in Galilee, how I told you this would all happen and I would appear to you. And so he changes the wording of his source so that it can fit with all of his appearances that he wants to have in Jerusalem. And so that's a pretty massive shift of everything taking place in Galilee to everything taking place in Jerusalem. And Luke changes the language of his source so that he can make it work that way. Those are just, some of the clearer instances, but then there's other things where, like, in Paul, the appearance to Peter is the first of the list. So you would think, okay, that's got to be the most important appearance. But the only possible narrative of the appearance to Peter that we have in any of the Gospels is in John. It's in John 21, where Peter and the other disciples are on the Lake of Galilee and they're fishing. And it's the last appearance in John, not the first appearance. And it's strikingly similar to the original call of Peter that we read about in Luke 5. The disciples are all on this boat. They've been fishing all night. They haven't caught anything. Jesus is on the shore. He says, hey, cast your nets over here. They cast them. Then they get this miraculously large catch of fish. And then Peter expresses his own insecurity about his sinfulness, and Jesus calls him to be in Luke, it's, he calls him to be a fisher of men. In John, it's, feed my sheep. But the structure of the narrative, the miraculously large catch of fish, so many of the details there's like 20 points of details, and Dale Allison in his book Resurrecting Jesus goes through each of the points where the narratives line up perfectly. And it suggests really strongly that what we're dealing with here is either Luke taking a post-resurrection story of Jesus' appearance to Peter and moving it to the original call, which is possible, or we're dealing with John taking a story from the original call of Peter and moving it to a post-resurrection setting. Or maybe we're dealing with some kind of memory conflation error where details from two different but kind of related events are kind of blended together into one really dramatic event. And that's also a possibility, but that's exactly how legendary development happens. So either, however you cut the cake, what we're dealing with here is not strict history, but something different. And so that's, the first appearance, which is arguably the most important appearance of Jesus, especially if you're reading from a naturalist perspective, where the first encounter to the leader of a movement kind of sets the tone and kind of can become the staging ground, the breeding ground for religious enthusiasm that takes over in a community and produces, like in instances throughout history of visions of the Virgin Mary or UFO sightings or things like that. If it is a purely psychological event taking over a whole community, the first one is the one that really matters to kind of set the expectation throughout the whole community for this kind of thing to keep happening. But we know next to nothing about what actually happened to Peter, and the only possible accounts of that experience that we have are obviously highly complicated and arguably legendary. So what do we do with that?
Yeah.
We just believe it.
But you asked about cognitive dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a huge subject. And man, I don't even know where to begin with that, honestly, because I feel like it would be a maybe we should have like a second conversation sometime and talk about that, because I feel like if I touch on it, it would beg more questions than it answers. And maybe we could, but
yeah, that's fine with me. We could go ahead and wrap up. Do you have any other questions, Amateur Exegete?
No, that's it for me.
Cool. Yeah, well, thank you both for coming on. This was a good conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is great.
Definitely gonna do this again sometime.
Absolutely.